Thank you guys for being here. Uh,
Yeah, thanks for having us.
so you guys are the amazing The Ex-Wife podcast, and if you want to introduce yourselves for those
Sure.
who do not know.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alicia of the Ex-Wife Podcast.
And I'm Justin of that same podcast.
Love it,
And-
love it. You got the podcast voice down perfect.
oh yeah, yeah. Every week we talk about whatever's going on in the new mutant nation of Krakoa. Not so new anymore. It's almost
Hmm,
3 years old now.
hmm.
But we dive in on what's keeping those merry mutants busy and where else they're splintering out to, as well as diving back into some back issues here and there and talking to some creators. We had Jerry Duggan on recently towards the end of the year and talking to some other folks coming on the show.
Amazing, amazing stuff. One of the personal things that I love about your show, if I can, is so Justin, you are the diehard X-Men fan with the background and all the comics and stuff. And what I love about your show is it's a very is you're basically introducing I mean you've been doing it for a while, so I don't know if introducing is correct anymore, but
Right.
indoctrinating maybe uh Alicia into the world of the X-Men, which is creates an interesting dynamic for that's unique for your guys' show.
Yeah, it was kind of a daunting setup. We have a friend that has said, "I think you need to change your tagline because she has been
Right.
brought in
Yeah.
one man's elaborate
The ex
scheme to
couple?
display."
I don't know.
Yeah,
Well, I think we can keep the podcast name, but it's no longer an elaborate scheme because the scheme has worked.
Well,
no. So I mean, the scheme has multiple iterations that continue to feed out into current continuity of our lives, where I just follow where she has interest and double down on that.
so the
So
scheme isn't over yet. She thinks
the
it's,
scheme,
but
the
there are
scheme is
more.
our
There's
life.
always more layers to
Right,
that.
right.
Well, speaking of schemes, let's start with the discussion of like what happened, and then we can move into the what I feel is almost a more interesting conversation of the real world impact that this had, because it was. I mean, I don't think there was another impact quite like it until perhaps the beginning of the Krakoan books, but even then it wasn't as pronounced. But
Right. Well, it's interesting, you think about the big impact, not to sidestep the
go ahead.
conversation of the recap, but so when House of X and Powers of 10 were about to launch, Marvel did this big picture look at X-Men continuity and labeled some key moments as the seminal moments in X-Men history. This
Mhm.
being one of them.
Mhm.
The only two in between this and House of X and Powers of 10 were Age of Apocalypse,
Mhm.
big shift, big ideological change in what
Yeah.
it meant to be mutants, and then New X-Men, Grant Morrison's run, and
Mhm.
they took it into another direction, doubling down on the school element
Mhm.
and trying to bring it into the almost mainstream by taking some cues from the movies. But this
Yeah.
was this was huge back then.
And it's as Miles says, I'd agree with that because I mean, again, not to go too far off field, but what is the show if nothing but tangents? Uh, uh, yeah. By the time this was like the very beginning of the '90s, and by the time Grant Morrison came on the book, which we'll maybe cover at a later date, but the new the new status quo by that point was starting to feel a little bit stale and old because it had been running for uh,
100
about a decade at that point.
Wow.
Writers were dropping off, readers were dropping off. It was losing that appeal. So yeah, I'd say, I mean, Grant Morrison basically reshuffled and re-energized and redid to the books what this did for the '90s, for the 2000s, and then you know questions of length or whatever aside, the Krakoan books have kind of done that for the 2020s.
Oh
So,
yeah.
um, but in this particular volume, um, which was my first real X-Men book that I read. So I've told this story before, but I basically my introduction to the team was through the classic cartoon series. But part, yeah, but part of what great gang over there. Part of what made the cartoon series so great was it was a I was talking with a friend the other day about this. It was a very easy transition at that point in time to go from an episode of the cartoon of the TV show and pick up an episode of whatever X-Men Uncanny or this was going on at the time and not feel completely lost
Mhm.
but they were all basically the same
Connect.
characters, just a slightly altered. Yeah.
Right. Because I
Like,
feel like the show did such a great job at taking the overall crystallization of these characters and just bringing you in on a base level through
yes.
Jubilee as your entryway character, but having such a great influence from Jim Lee's designs
Hmm.
launching in this book. And if you've read the art and making of the animated series,
Oh, have I read it?
they talk about right.
It doesn't quite show up because, yeah.
Yeah, they talk
Heavy.
about the hesitancy to use those designs because of when they were going to launch the show was when Jim Lee was about to announce that he was leaving to form
Mhm.
Image Comics.
Yeah, yeah. Which, you know, as an ex, I can understand. It was like, what do you? We just give you a podcast. So what do you mean you're leaving? I thought it'd
Right.
be so well.
We just gave you the book.
Right.
Yikes.
But yeah. So the in the book, really quickly, it's very simple, really. Magneto, after his adventures in the Savage Land with Rogue, which again I didn't even know about when I first read this, so it's a very newcomer, easy read. Has decided, forget everything. I'm done. You all can do whatever you want down there. I'm taking my asteroid and going home, basically, right? Um, until the escalation in human anti-mutant relations, which was kind of a thing before this. Again, the original X Factor was heavily built on that, but I really feel like the 90s really put a special emphasis on that aspect, and this was kind of the start of that.
Yeah.
And they basically show up on this guy's door, Daddy Joseph, as I like to call him, and the bare-chested white robe and everything, begging to be taken in, and it's
Dreadlord.
mhm. um, and so yeah, and of course, the X-Men have to go deal with that, as is often the case.
Right, yeah. I thought it was so interesting because Magneto is essentially retiring. He's like, I'm
Mhm.
done
Yeah.
with your
Yep, 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 yep.
troubles.
You
I'm
all
I'm
can sort out
going,
your
I'm above and beyond your laws.
literally.
How are you going to control me? I'm up here
Right.
in space.
Hmm.
Get out. Like this
Right.
is
It's
this
a
is my
grumpy
retirement
old
plan.
neighbor next door. Yeah, get
Get
off
off
my
my
lawn.
lawn.
Yeah. Go kick space rocks.
Right. Um, but the part of him that's always been there of wanting to be the savior can't
Mhm.
help himself in the end but take them in. But
Well, and such an interesting manipulation on a couple of levels from Fabian Cortez,
Yeah.
right? And to essentially getting suckered into this cause that he had stepped away from in
mhm.
a problem that Cortez starts with the acolytes.
Yeah,
Feel like he kind of is like testing the waters with it, and then the X-Men are like, "Oh, Magneto, you're here. You must have reverted back to your evil self." So they kind of
right,
put that layer on top of it,
Yeah.
on top of him, and he's like, "Y'all don't even want to have a conversation. You don't want to like think
right, yeah,
about where I've gotten to up to
Yeah.
this point. You're
You,
just gonna be like, no, you're still
you
evil.
want me to be the bad guy? I'm gonna be the bad guy
If that's
then.
what you
And
want."
I'm gonna do it right.
which it is a very amazing insight that I hadn't really thought of before. But I wonder if that was somewhat uh, subtextual context from Chris Claremont there.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
Because this undoes all of the work that he's been doing for
exactly.
the last
And it
5
was
or so years, right?
Yeah.
even longer if you count like
18, I
the
think.
speeding.
But yeah. And it's famously part of the reason why he left after so long, which again makes sense. I'd be frustrated too if it's like, no, we're gonna ignore all of that and go back to, you know, um, yeah. Uh, so I was wondering, as I decided I'm gonna call him from now on when I woke up today, the human steroid, um, Fabian Cortez. Uh, Alicia, it occurred to me because he comes back at the later at the Krakoan age and is
Mhm.
very much not quite at the height that he is in this, mildly. Um,
Found.
is this your first time reading like the first introduction between him and Magneto and stuff?
So it's my first time reading it. Justin and I talked about the first issue of the 3 issues that we're talking
Mm.
about today, when we first started the podcast. So, like, my introduction to Krakoa included learning about all of the seminal moments. So, I was like, going back through this, I was like, "Okay, I remember hearing about this story, but I hadn't physically read it, like, sat down and actually read it." So, it's
Yeah,
interesting
great.
to yeah, it's interesting to sort of see Fabian in this instance and then to where he is now in the comics, where here he's very sure of himself and very um feeling like he's in control of the situation and like he can take charge, where I feel as where he is now, he sort of like questions himself a little bit
Yeah.
more and like he wants to get to that point, but it feels like something happened in his continuity, whether it was this or things that happened after the fact, that he kind of was like a dog, like hit on the nose with a newspaper.
Yeah.
And he's kind of like, oh, is it okay for me to like my Fabian self or no?
Never. It's never okay.
No.
Yeah.
So it's funny you should say that. A few things actually happen after this, but before his reappearance that sets that stuff up. I really feel like those writers in the Krakoan age are drawing a lot of inspiration, in particular, from the '90s
Mm.
comics, both in terms of the characters, but also the lore that they're using. And this is also the first appearance of the Acolytes,
Hmm.
uh, which is different than the Brotherhood. Uh,
It's less on the nose, it's not Brotherhood of
yeah.
Evil. We're the acolytes of the cause of Magneto.
you know, it's always kind of been a hard thing to go back and retcon, right?
Yeah.
Well, why is this? I think he's evil. Why does it call his
Right.
team? But
But
yeah,
because that's what you think of him,
Right.
humans.
Might as well
yes,
embrace it.
exactly. It's the feather in the cap thing, right? The yeah, um, and big. I mean, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, but Jim Lee. This is Jim Lee basically at his beginning, in my opinion, at his best. But although he's still an amazing artist over at DC, these are like the looks that
Yeah.
not only will last them throughout the decade, but I feel like to this day, even newer fans who maybe didn't read it, like this is how Rogue looks, right? This is how Jean looks, right? That this are forevermore moving forward the looks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gambit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
These are their definitive styles that everybody recalls. And if you haven't watched the show or read a comic, if you see them, you're like, oh yeah, okay.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't really watch the show growing up and I didn't read comics, but I knew that these are the costumes that these characters wore before
Yeah.
I even read a single thing. I was like, oh, yeah, you showed me a picture.
Oh
There's a
yeah.
handful that I could name.
Underpants on his outside of his
Rogue,
pants. Yeah.
Rogue, Gambit, Cyclops,
Yeah.
Storm. Like, those are their looks. Like, that's what they wear.
So, it's interesting. I was trying to. It's also the first appearance of the hover chair,
Mhm.
which didn't last, but it's there. It's also in the cartoon. It's in Doctor Strange too. Uh,
The hover chair is just cool.
Right.
yes, yeah. No, well, he can walk now, so I guess there's no real good reason to bring it back. But kind of missed it.
And it's always classic. You know,
Right.
that hover chair
Yeah.
back there, that's never
Yeah,
going.
that's the one.
Right.
Yeah. Um, it's also like it's the launch of like again going back to the impact that this had. And please stop me if I'm over speaking. I'm so passionate about this because this was my gateway into the X-Men. This is my stuff here. Um, was all of the attached merchandising, which I would say is perhaps the biggest difference between this and the big Powers of X. I mean, different time, but you couldn't go to any store without seeing X-Men branded pasta, cereal, underwear,
Yeah.
whatever.
Right. Right. The Toy Biz action figure lines,
Yeah.
the boxes, the thermoses.
I feel like that must have been like, because like I said, I didn't watch the cartoon, I didn't read the comics. I feel like all of that, like advertising, seeing it in stores, like that is what subconsciously got stored in my brain of like
I
recognizing the
yes,
characters.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a big part of the reason why
Hmm.
those looks are forever attached to those characters now. It's because it wasn't just confined to the comics. I mean, you
Hmm.
couldn't not see them for like a decade. Um,
Well, and the trading cards too. You want to talk about big cultural impact? Jim Lee's
mm,
designs on all of the X-Men trading cards. I have a stack back there, but just how that trading cards were one of my entryway points in before I was really reading intently, before, you know, around the time of the show, just to get, I would collect so many different runs and packs and just trying to know who these characters are. And those were so spot on and stuck with them in my mind, at least, because you're right that their designs, they started to switch up gradually, especially after Jim Lee left. You know, a new artist wants to put his own spin on what their looks are and change here and there, but yeah.
yeah. Well, I still have a binder full of my X-Men cards from back in the day. Um, yeah, no, yeah, I mean, again, and it made it into even the TV show, which was my start, which um, they, as we were talking about earlier, they didn't want them to use,
Right.
as Jim Lee had just left to help form Image Comics at the time. And so the art team at the show purposely sent in like really horrible, over exaggerated drawings. This is how it was like, oh, should we use these? Until basically Marvel begged them to, no, 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 no. The original designs were fine. We take it all
Yeah.
back. It's in the book. But this is also, I feel like that's worth also touching on is the whole. This is also kind of the beginning of that Image influence as well, right? Even before Image itself was formed, this was up until this point, it was writers then artists
Right.
to a large extent. Um, this was basically editors and artists running the books, and writers for the
Right.
first time really came in secondary, which created some amazing artwork that lasts to this day. But
Right. Right.
really,
Yeah.
yeah,
Even with what New Mutants into
X
X
Force,
Force, yeah, with Rob Liefeld, that was really
yeah.
the start of the artist-led movement in terms of Marvel Comics, and then you know
DC was doing it as well at the time, and yeah,
and yeah, Louise Simonson kind of got pushed out in a similar way of like, okay, you're just doing whatever you want to do. You're not listening to the direction that I'm writing. So what's the point? What am I doing here other than just writing dialogue for your action sequences that
And the
right,
cover for this too is like one of the most iconic things like that they all connect, right? Like that's a
yeah,
huge staple.
highest
You
selling comic
see that and you're like,
yes,
oh, I know this as this is an X-Men thing. This is a thing. This is
been redone.
we got it on a mug. Like people have
yeah,
posters. Like, like that's a huge thing that kind of carried on from this particular story as well. And then the gold team and the blue team, that whole
Yes.
separation of the teams, like that
Yeah.
comes from this, right? This is where
Well,
it
because
started.
yeah, absolutely. Well, because the last story brought kind of all the characters back onto the board.
Hmm.
Uh, check out that video. If you guys want, link below. Sorry, doing the YouTube thing. But um, yeah, now they're all here, and there's like so many of them that this is indeed where the blue and gold team are formed, and yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's crossover because they all live in this. But really, if you want to read these characters, you read this book, and if you want to read about these characters, then it's over here. Um, yeah, I mean, uh, Danger Room becomes much more of the holodeck pronounced thing than spinning wheels of death. Um, uh, hey, I love me some spinning wheels of death, but um, yeah, it's just again, I could talk forever. The
Yeah,
impact.
those Shi'ar upgrades to the Danger Room, those
Hmm.
really interesting, and even just the rereading it. I've read these 3 issues so many times throughout my life, but
Same.
rereading it, just seeing Xavier's line to Cyclops so quickly established of I am going to go with your recommendation and split the team into 2 tactical squads.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We're going to lead one, and Storm's going to lead one. I mean, those Cyclops and Storm, they've been the leaders of the
Yes.
X-Men thus far. I mean, Nightcrawler tried his hand a couple of issues, failed.
Yeah.
Wolverine filled in for Storm here and there during the 80s. Not as well of a
What later? Sure. Yeah.
right, much more of a largely what would X-Force become, much more of a tactical kill squad almost.
Hmm.
Yeah. No.
Jean does some pretty amazing things in this.
Yeah.
Really like amping up her powers and the use of her powers and her confidence in the use of her powers.
I mean, this era is what made me fall in love with Jean as a character. It starts here, but there's um so like she literally one shortly after this. Not to be too spoilery, but fights Victor, and it's like Sabretooth, and it's no contest. It's one of the best. I mean, it's a panel that's stuck in my memory to this day. I read it, when people go, "Oh, she's a wimp," or continues to faint, or whatever. Which hey, I get it, but like I point to these comics and I'm like, no, look, she's both the mother of the team and she can hold her own ground. Like,
She's not Marvel Girl right now.
Yeah,
Flaskin is introduced for the first time in this,
that's
which is
good. Yeah.
interesting. It kind of
Yeah.
faded away. The counterpoint to Muty.
It's come back in the Krakoan era here and
Yeah.
there. You know,
Does it?
I mean, I liked reading this story and actually like digging into it. I think it's really difficult for me to like get in it sometimes when I read Claremont's writing because it's so many words.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
but I thought that it was a fun read. I think when I initially heard of this story, I was a little taken aback by the fact that we're just reverting Magneto right back to a villain and we're just taking away like all his development up to that point. But I think it's really handled in a way that he really is saying like, you're telling me what I have to be, so I guess I'm just going to be that.
Yeah.
Um, I think the sort of flip-flopping, even though it was sort of like seems like a mind control type thing of Cyclops and the blue team sort of being like, oh, we're on Magneto's side. I thought that was interesting. Learning about what Moira did to him.
Right.
I didn't know anything about that. And I liked how that kind of played into him saying, like, well, I have to be how I am now because you made me this way.
Because yeah.
Yeah, so I think like as a 3-issue arc to really set up why it is that Magneto is going to be the way he is now, instead of just saying, well, this is because this is what the artists and the editors are making me do, like putting that in the perspective of Magneto saying, well, this is what you all are making me do, and kind of
Yeah.
this is what you've decided I must be, so I have to be this face of, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, and whether you want to save me or not, like it doesn't matter. This is my role in our society. I thought that was a really cool way to still give him authority on, you know, making it his decision, even though someone else decided it for him. So I enjoyed reading it and getting to kind of see that perspective, and also just like I think this is a story and this an era of comics that's a really integral to what X-Men are now. So
Well,
getting the opportunity to kind of further my knowledge on that front is cool too.
Yeah.
awesome. If I could just quickly, and then Justin, I'll let you go. But this is actually my favorite version of Magneto, the character Magneto, and I have a feeling it's not just mine, considering every show, all the movies, everything that would follow is basically using this kind of template of the reluctant sort of good guy, bad guy, savior mold, right? That
Mhm.
is really set up here. But sorry, Justin, go ahead.
No, yeah, I definitely think we touched on it earlier. The elements of autobiography here with Claremont reluctantly penning this as, you know, this is not where he had been building the books to, right?
Mhm.
His goal, and he's talked about this in interviews, was to kill Charles Xavier by issue 300. That was what he was building towards.
Which
That Magneto would be fully instated as the headmaster of the team, and they would be on this arc against the Shadow King. And
Mm-hmm.
to piggyback off of what Alicia said, the huge retcon from Moira and connecting to that Defenders issue that I've read entirely too many times because of trial episodes with Gray Malcolm Lane, but
yes.
Alpha, the Ultimate Mutant, de-aging Magneto to a baby, and then some genetic manipulation affected to Magneto to make him more open to the ideals, and that being really what's credited as his turn into being a hero. I was looking up I believe it's Powers of 10, number 6, where there's a journal entry from Moira where she talks about how we've lost Magneto. I tried to do something to make her a better man, and I think we've turned him even further away from our cause.
Oh,
That's this moment.
that's this.
That's this moment where he realizes that this was something done to him, unbeknownst to him,
Not his
to
choice.
try and influence their grouping. And the fact that that is specifically, you know, they only highlight a couple of journal entries, but it's, I think, 5 or 6 before Moira disappears from continuity for a number of years in Adjectiveless X-Men, I think like 110 or something like that years later. But yeah, this is very influential in terms of the voice, the tone, the future of these teams, these characters. You know, you're talking about how this arc was your entryway point. My first comic of X-Men. So I had already been watching the show. I had already been collecting the cards. My first comic was X-Men 25. So this series, but 2 years later, when Magneto rips the adamantium from Wolverine's body,
Yeah.
that image will forever be burned into my psyche because of, you know, like I'm 6 years old and I feel like I came online because of that image. And I was like, whoa, this is
No,
this is the book. This is the book.
yeah, I'm completely with you on that. I was just, Alicia was laughing at that, which was making me think that it's probably one of those images where you had to be there at the time, at that age, right?
Oh,
But
yeah.
I mean,
I'm sure that's a
yeah,
form.
same. Like I mean, come on,
I
coming
mean
out
it.
more with him, like it's horrific.
Oh yeah. I mean it made me like go oh when I saw it in my 30s the first time I saw it. So
And
We
how
were kids.
right.
right.
Yeah, well, and
that-
Wolverine was like this mixed like in the '90s. Is really like, I mean, he was always cool, but the '90s, he was like, it's like, okay, wow.
He's their flagship almost at that point.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And to talk about the resonance of this team, you know, we have the image of the blue team behind us, the cover of X-Men #1 signed by both Chris and Jim. Like this is still very much so influential on how I view
Mhm.
this team, this franchise, these characters. And I feel like, you know, this Magneto Acolytes counterpoint to the X-Men just layers in. You know, we say it's often back to the basics, but it is enhancing his motivation, his point of view, what he, Magneto as a leader, does going forward.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree, and couldn't have said it better myself. So, on that note, where can people follow you guys?
Oh yeah, you can find us all over the internet. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at the Ex-Wife Podcast. That's THEXWIFE as in X-Men, not former wife.
Yeah, like we said before, we talk about the current issues, we talk about Krakoa, and then we dive back here and there, depending on relevance, depending on interest, and occasionally have some cool interviews with some creators of the books. So always trying to dig into the insights that they can provide of this journey.
Definitely go check them out. There will be links to all of those socials below. And thank you so much for talking about one of my favorite comics with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. Yeah, ton of fun.